Well, we're at 5-2, so we resume. I ought to start by making something very clear about modifications. I was saving it up. I was going to address it, but I was going to save it up until we dealt with air quality. But perhaps it's more proper and practical to deal with it now. Yes, I have the Council's suggested modifications to these policies that we're talking about today, and there are a series of others in there. I just want to make very clear about something very clear about the status of those and when they came in. No, we can't recommend a mod or a modification that hasn't been consulted on. So of course, well, I say of course, that's not fair. They will be consulted on in due course. The reason I don't want to be too specific about the procedure going forward is that we haven't reached the end of the Phase 4 hearings. Once we reach the end of the Phase 4 hearings, my colleague and I are going to need to have a discussion about the way forward, and it may be, I'll put it no stronger than that at the end of Phase 4 we decide that it's time, yes, we don't need to deal with anything else. We can consult on the modifications and some of the background documents that have come in. At that point, people are given the opportunity to comment on them. So we then take that comment, and there's I can't remember, I think there's a specific consultation period of 6 weeks or something when that takes place. They're then collected together, and then my colleague and I have to decide whether we need further hearings to deal with the modifications. We can, or we might not think that's necessary, and we could at that stage proceed to write a report. I'm not saying that's what we're going to do, because we haven't had the discussion. We haven't got to the end of the hearings yet. But if we did make that decision, that would when we'd say to the Council, publish the mods for consultation and the background information. We'll take that consultation from everybody, and after that, we have to take a view on whether we need further hearings to talk about the modifications. I hope that's helpful. I'm trying to do it in a way that doesn't tie anyone's hands, if you see what I mean, because I can't say for sure at this stage what the procedure will be, because Simon and I have to have a conflab about that. Does that help? Mr. May.
Just very quickly, so that's very helpful indeed, because I think there was a growing concern that we'd received these modifications but had no real opportunity other than today to comment on them. If we know that's going to be available in due course, that's excellent. The only point I was going to have made at the end of the discussion before the break was, I think, listening to the discussion, we've had this really interesting concern about the level of detail you need. With the NPPF paragraph 154 test that Mr. Corsi has pointed us to at one end of the spectrum, and Mr. Linus's, if I can quote, I think perfectly reasonable concern that we ossify the local plan by over-prescriptive wording. And somewhere between those two definitions, there's a sound plan. And my concern increasingly is that the omissions have veered on the side of making it less sound, but if we have an opportunity to come back to that in comments on the modifications, then we're very happy to leave it till then. Okay,
that opportunity will be there for sure. It's a statutory requirement. It has to be done that way. Well, statutory requirement, but it's a requirement. The process has to work that way. We can't be reporting on modifications unless they've been consulted on.
Sorry,
Mr. Linus,
I'm grateful for that. And just to confirm that the idea behind the modification schedule is to keep a running total, if you like, of mods that are being proposed through discussions at the examination, but also as appended to the hearing statements before the hearing sessions. So we're trying to give notice as best we can of modifications before the hearing sessions come about. And obviously the purpose of the examination is to discuss issues in a way which may reveal more. That's the entire purpose behind the examination. Beyond that, I can say to Mr. May that what we intend to do before the end of Phase 4 is to address you, sir, and Mr. Barker publicly on what we would suggest by way of timings and for main mods, so that can be done publicly, and everyone's aware of what we hope to achieve through the main mods process.
Well, thank you for that. That's helpful, because I think if you weren't going to address us on it, we would probably want to talk about that in open session anyway, because everybody, whether they're present at that last hearing of Phase 4 or watching, they need to know what's going on. So yeah, that's helpful. Good. I hope that assists. Air quality, then. I don't know, Mr. Linus, whether there was anything you wanted to say in starting us off on this point.
Just very briefly, Sir Shute said, apart from Mr. Ridge sitting to my right, you'll have seen appear at the table Mike Southcombe and Andrew Gilla, who are both public protection officers with expertise in air quality at the Council. And to the extent they need to, they may contribute this afternoon. Although, as you said, the main underlying theme for the air quality discussion bears some similarity to what we've heard already. And if I can just set the scene this way, that the context for the discussion that we're having this afternoon is a general trend of improving air quality across the city, which has been reflected in the monitoring data prepared by the Council over the last 10 years. And that's already resulted in the revocation of 2 former air quality management areas in Fulford and on Salisbury Terrace. We also continue to see improvements in air quality in the remaining AQMA, subject to some challenges which one accepts has to be met in any AQMA in a city centre location under current monitoring results, but they reflect a gradual improvement, nonetheless, in the long term in emissions from the York fleet, which also reflect the impact of air quality improvement initiatives, which are set out in detail in its monitoring. That's the broad context. As far as the plan is concerned, the main question relates to whether or not the cumulative effect of the plan is acceptable, and we say that, as the hearing statement explains, that effect will be acceptable, and it has been demonstrated through the sustainability appraisal work as supported by information which is before the examination, including the air quality monitoring reports and the information on the comparative effects of different spatial distributions relating to the plan. The sustainability appraisal, as you have seen in the note that was prepared for the Council, addressed air quality as one of the sustainability objectives and looked at the baseline in successive iterations of the essay, along with an essay of the themed policies on strategic sites, reaching conclusions by reference to the sustainable objective relating to air quality. You have the air quality monitoring reports that I've mentioned as well, EXCYC 78, 80 and most recently 106, which established this overall pattern of air quality improvements over the long term in York. And you have the analysis in EXCYC 91, the comparative effects of different spatial distributions that I've mentioned, which show that despite an increase in trips on the network, the overall picture is a forecast of NOx levels falling, as well as PM 2.5 and PM 10 levels falling through the plan period. We say that information is adequate to conclude that the cumulative impact on the plan is acceptable, and you have adequate evidence before you to reach that view. We can come on to matters dealing with the drafting of ENV1, but plainly that policy, we say, provides a robust basis which allows for the Council to determine individual applications on an appropriate basis which raise air quality concerns. Thank you very much.
Good. Mr. Kousia, do you want to go first? Yes. I saw you reaching for the...
I think that there's a major difference between the council and ourselves, sir, but I think it can be expressed very shortly. So we say, sir, that there's no technical study of the cumulative impacts on air quality. And we understand that, that it wouldn't be a technical study of the type which you would submit for a planning application, but there would need to be some calculations, particularly for those routes, sir, where there is going to be very substantial increases in traffic. And so we do make the point that if you take the A19, which was very recently an ACMA, there are increase in traffic of over, around 48% of congestion. That would signify there are potential problems of worsening air quality. Equally, sir, when one looks at the inner ring road, and I directed you to the relevant pages today of traffic impacts. Again, you've got increases around 48% on the inner ring road of traffic delay, which implies congestion, so, which means a lot of standing traffic, a lot of belching out fumes. So just to deal with the point, the SA point, sir, the wording, the council says in their hearing statement that air quality has been comprehensively addressed by the sustainability appraisal. And so they refer to table 5.1. So there is absolutely no evidence of the type which I would categorize as evidence in the sustainability appraisal. Sustainability assessment, I should say. And so if you look actually at the wording in that appendix, which deals with cumulative impact, it is so high level, it's just that it really isn't very helpful. Whilst draft local plan policy will help to minimise air quality impacts arising, sorry, I'll get it in front of me, arising, including through locating development in accessible locations, reducing the need to travel, transport infrastructure improvements, blah, blah, blah. Development would have negative effects on this objective resulting from the associated increase in vehicle use. This may be exacerbated in the city where some areas already have air quality issues. So that is on page 144 of CD 008, which is referenced in the hearing statement. The Council's hearing statement has been their primary evidence. And so there are similar statements throughout the essay on air quality. But that is so high level, it really is almost worthless in terms of the guidance, which, in terms of the guidance, so obviously the relevant guidance you need to take into account is the NPPF paragraph 124, which requires that the cumulative impacts on air quality from individual sites in local areas to be taken into account in planning policies, which should seek compliance with national objectives for pollutants. So that is so that you have no evidence on, nothing that would actually constitute evidence to begin for you to ascertain whether the planned policies will secure compliance with national objectives for pollutants, or indeed will make, could well, because the increased congestion could make it existing position worse. So the highest the council have given you is in their paragraph 735 of their hearing statement, which seeks to suggest that because the projected changes in the vehicle fleet composition The forecast levels of air pollution will fall within the city, which indicates air quality impacts will be acceptable. So probably as a very generalised statement, that's probably true. But what it doesn't do is actually look at the area. It's not very helpful to you where there are existing problems of air quality or where the increased congestion will lead to problems of air quality through cumulative impact. And it's the lack of firm evidence, lack of any technical appraisal whatsoever of cumulative impact where this plan is lacking and where it fails the requirements of the guidance. And so that's all I've got to say. It is a very simple issue. It's the lack of any technical appraisal, because the essay is not does not constitute a technical appraisal. It is no more than simply assertions by probably a person as unqualified as myself in dealing with these matters.
Thank you, Mr. Coursier. I don't know, Mr. Lannis, whether you'd prefer me to take a number of comments first and then respond, or would you like to?
I'm happy to respond.
Please do, yeah, that's probably as well.
Thank you. I mean, there is a fundamental difference here, and we clearly disagree with Mr. Coursier, because fundamentally there's no requirement in law or policy to carry out the form of technical study that he's suggesting has to be carried out here. There's no specific requirement in the guidance to draw any particular prescriptive draw on any particular prescriptive evidence base, no specific requirement on how evidence is prepared to support the plan. And within that, there isn't anything in policy which suggests there has to be a technical study. And whilst Mr. Coursier says he's not indicating there needs to be something along the lines of a planning application, in reality that's close to what is being suggested here. We say you have adequate information in front of you to reach a judgment on cumulative impacts. The sustainability appraisal submissions dealt in detail with these points which have been raised by Mr. Coursier before. EXCYC 84 deals with air quality and identifies how a series of sustainability appraisals dating from 2013 through to the sustainability appraisal for the Regulation 19 publication draft in 2018 dealt with the baseline, which is in Appendix D to CD09A. It looks through the policies by reference to air quality in Appendix J and sites in Appendix I, and summarises the position in cumulative terms in Table 6.4 of the main report, with commentary in the report as well. Beyond that, you have a very clear picture about the general trend in air quality in the York area, which, despite increases in traffic movements, are influenced strongly by vehicle fleet improvements, which are described in much more detail in the monitoring reports, which have led to the revocation of 2 AQMAs and informed a detailed suite of measures which the Council has sought to improve air quality through over a number of years and will continue to do so. And you have the information and the comparative effects of different spatial distributions, which again give a broad holistic picture which is appropriate for plan making at this level on what the overall future trend of pollutants will be, which is entirely consistent with what we have seen in the past and what is happening in the future. So we just reject any suggestion from Mr. Coursier that the evidence is inadequate, because he's looking for what is not necessary in our submission to allow the conclusion that the plan is sound.
Mr. Cursier, come back.
So I'll take you back to paragraph 124 and the sort of evidence that you need to be satisfied on this point. Indeed, sir, if the situation were, as Mr. Linus says, that the air quality impacts of development are always going to be satisfactory, sir, one wonders what the purpose of EMV1 and the need for most major applications actually put in air management assessments at application stage. This is a city which has a major problem of air quality. I think, and that is why that is stated in their own reports, sir. And that's why major action has been taken in the past and why major action is being still required. And you need to be satisfied, sir, that the local plan will not exacerbate that. And given the levels of congestion which are being thrown up by the new traffic modelling, and we're talking about in some of on the inner ring road, something like 47, 46, 48% increase in traffic delay, and adjacent to housing, so that should trigger some proper assessment of impacts, and that has not been done, sir.
Anything to add, Mr. Linus?
No, sir. Apart from to say that, as you'll see when you look through the references that have been provided in relation to sustainability appraisal, note the sustainability appraisal and anticipates there will potentially be impacts, but also says you must take into account mitigation that will be delivered through the plan, including that which has been described in detail by Mr. Ridge, and through the application of policies, including ENV1. We say that in combination with the evidence that has been provided about what's happened in the past with air quality, what's happening at present and what will happen in the future through the monitoring review is adequate for you to reach a view as a matter of judgment that cumulative impacts will be acceptable. I think this is really going over ground that's been raised before. Generally in relation to the sustainability appraisal, and reflects in part points that have been raised on transport as well. Mr. Ridge, I think has something to add.
Yes, I think there was one point I wanted to add, which I think, Mr. Cursier, the figures that you're quoting for the inner ring road increase in journey times relate to 2040.
That's correct, yes, because of course the plan allocations go to 2038.
Yes. And I'm not quite sure when the current DFT mandated time is for the end of sales of fossil fuel powered vehicles is. I think it's 2030 or possibly 2032, but anyway, it is significantly before that congestion, if it does present, is forecast to present. So there will be significant mitigation to the air quality impact simply through changing of the fleet.
So that may or may not be the case. Obviously, we don't. It's entire speculation as to how long the older parts of the fleet will take to be off the road. But so the key point is that there is that congestion. You have, if the council were indeed to be serious, that should be factored into any appraisal. It's the lack of the appraisal which I wish to argue about, not the actually whether it will go up or down, because we have no evidence about that, sir. And that's the key point I'm making to you.
Shall I widen the discussion out, or? Yeah. Mr. May.
Thank you, sir. I wanted to reinforce what Mr. Cursier has said, really with 3 points. First of all, at least at the high level, the sustainability appraisal in the table we've referred to only uses proximity to an air quality management area as the test. So, not surprisingly, the new development sites on the fringes of York score 0. They don't have a problem because they're further away. There is no assessment in that of the impact of individual sites on air quality in critical parts of the network. The second point I wanted to make is we have the interesting analysis in CYC 91, which suggests the changes in pollutant levels between 2019 and 2033 as a result of government guidance on the emission levels from different types of traffic at different times over the period. And that suggests, interestingly, a 65% reduction in oxides of nitrogen over that period. But it only suggests 4% and 9% for particulates PM10 and PM2.5. That analysis, again, is highly aggregate. The way in which particularly oxides of nitrogen operate is very complicated, and it will depend very much on the local circumstances. As we know out here in Gilligate, where actually now we have a higher level of oxides of nitrogen than at any time since 2014, despite the improvements in the vehicle fleet. So it's a complicated process, and that analysis, I'm afraid, is too simplistic. But the third point I wanted to make is that last year the World Health Organization said two things. First of all, there's no safe level for any of these pollutants, and therefore the guidelines have to be a balance between cost and effectiveness. And they have produced new air quality guidelines which reduce the threshold for nitrogen dioxide from 40 micrograms per cubic meter to 10, and they also make significant reductions in the two particulates. Now, you might argue that that's only guidance from the World Health Organization and shouldn't be taken into account now, but the government's own committee, advisory committee, COMEP, has said very clearly that these levels, these new World Health Organization air quality guidelines, are suitable as long-term targets to inform policy development. We're talking here today about a long-term plan to inform policy development. And therefore, we would argue, based on the government's own guidance, the Council ought to be taking these new standards into play. And I've simply taken the CYC 91 simplistic predictions of reductions and the levels we've got in the 2022 air quality report. And you find that none of the 8 nitrogen dioxide sites would meet the World Health Organization AQGs by 2033. None of the PM2.5 ones would, and 2 out of 4 of the PM10 ones wouldn't. So, on all those counts, our feeling is that the answer to your question is no. There is not evidence that the air quality impacts will be acceptable.
Thank you, Mr. May. Mr. Linus, I'd better come to you.
Thank you, sir. Picking up on a few points there. As for Mr. Curcier's point about improvements due to electrification of the fleet, what was done in EXCYC 91 was to apply DFT data book values to the number of vehicle kilometres or operated minutes within the model scenarios. As those DFT data book values would assume improvements through electrification of the fleet, and we say that's an entirely appropriate basis upon which to come up with the figures. So it's wrong to suggest there isn't any evidence to indicate what improvements there would be, and it's fanciful to suggest that there aren't going to be any improvements. If that's what Mr. Kersey is saying, if he's accepting there will be improvements, then the DFT data book is an appropriate basis upon which to take those improvements into account. Secondly, the approach that was taken in EXCYC 91 is a level of calculation assessment which is appropriate to this level of the plan. Sites were assessed, strategic sites were assessed individually within the scope of the sustainability appraisal, having regard to mitigation that could be delivered holistically through the plan and through plan policies. So again, we reiterate, we don't accept any criticism of the amount of information that is available. As for the WHO guidelines point that's raised by Mr. May, the new WHO air quality guidelines are, it's correct, significantly more stringent than the current air quality objectives, but they do not apply in UK law. We should stress that they have been set, as we understand it, with no consideration given to their actual achievability. And in practice, it may be that the guidelines are unachievable for local authority areas. And the WHO guidelines themselves acknowledge that the guidelines are very challenging, but fundamentally, they do not yet apply in UK law. There isn't anything which confirms that the current WHO guidelines will be aligned to UK air quality objectives as a matter of law, and therefore it's not necessary for the plan to be prepared on that basis. Thank you, sir.
Is there anything anyone wants to add? Ms. Hilton.
So, thank you. We just wanted to think a little bit about the cumulative effect of the sites. So, it's clear that a lot more traffic will be generated from the sites ST4, ST15, and also by the increased University of York activity, whether or not that be on a new site. And a lot of that traffic will funnel in through parts of Hezlington. The ST4 site, it only has one access road, I believe, which goes into Field Lane. Field Lane, which runs from Hull Road towards Hezlington and in through to York. It already has considerable congestion at peak times, and it runs past a primary school, and the traffic trying to get into Field Lane from the primary school also causes congestion. So you have a primary school with stationary traffic on two sides of it, and that can only be extremely exacerbated by the development of ST4, plus the traffic coming in from ST15, whatever route that eventually takes, plus, as I say, the increased University of York activity. So the effect on the Hezlington village area and the wider Hezlington parish will be considerable. On top of that, you've got potentially the junction onto the A64, the grade-separated junction, which being elevated will share the pollution further and wider than if it was an ordinary junction. We think that according to the NPPF page 196, that there are every single criteria which should trigger a detailed emission assessment is met by the local plan. So it's going to generate an increase in traffic congestion. It's going to have a significant change in traffic volumes. There'll be a significant change in vehicle speeds, both faster, because you're going to have a faster link road across to the A64 than the current country lanes, and also slower, because traffic will be backed up, and slower if there's a cycle route that you're having to negotiate different users along a single track highway. The traffic composition will be altered. There's going to be new exposure to close to existing sources of air pollution with the new link road. There's going to be very significant impacts during construction, and I should say also during destruction. So during the demolition of the airstrip, and then obviously the building of ST15, and also whatever works have to take place on OS 10, which we'll be discussing on Thursday, Matter 5, forgotten what they're called now, open spaces. All of those are going to create a huge amount of emissions. And there'll also be obviously a very long-term construction site with associated heavy plant and HGV flows. So we would say that all of those mean that a requirement for an emission assessment is triggered. And we think that that needs to be done soon, and it needs to be done very rigorously, because it's not only about not breaching whatever the current air quality regulations are, or whatever the new WHO ones are, but it's also about monitoring the quality of air that is there now, so that people know what has been lost. And if we don't know what's there now, we can go on monitoring once work has started, but we'll never know what has been lost. Thank you.
I'll carry on this side. Yeah, Mr. Merritt, and then I'll come back to Mr. Coos here.
I'd obviously like to echo some of Tony May's points, but I particularly just want to pick two things up. The first is his point about particularly in terms of NOxes, the non-linear relationship. The presence of NOx in particular locations is not simply a function of the volume of emissions. It's actually also to do with the air chemistry and behaviour. How much dispersal there is through wind, the effect of enclosure, the impact of the degree of ozone that's in the atmosphere, the degree of sunlight. And therefore, actually looking at the implications of the plan in terms of the AQMA areas and the specifics is quite important. Simply to take a global reduction in emissions could completely obscure what's really going on in those areas of concern. And that's, I think, why we are pushing this particular issue. Because, I mean, the reality is we should have been below 40 in terms of the original legislation 7 years ago, and we're still not. We're still some way off. And as has been pointed out in terms of Gilligate, last year we were actually worse than we were 2014, 7 years ago. So it's not necessarily going down linearly in the sense that has been implied. So I think it is important that we do that more, have a look at the cumulative impacts, which is what the MPF requires in our AQMAs. And, this isn't an academic exercise. Air pollution, contributes to tens of thousands of deaths a year. Now, that is declining, but that is still an enormous volume of death. Plus, there's, a large amount of ill health deteriorating quality of life in the years before people die that is related to this. And the casual approach of the council's council on this matter, when it's actually people's lives at risk, I think is very disappointing.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt. I'll come to Mr. Corsi and then I'll come back to the council. Go on.
So I thought I'd finished earlier, but Mr. Linus challenged me on a point, so I feel I need to respond to a degree. I think that Mr. Merritt actually said much of what I was going to say. First of all, and unfortunately I don't have the reference to it, but the note dealing with greenhouse gases, the major point to make is, is that, of course, in that is showing that although in NOx's it will be a significant decline citywide, there is a very small decline only in particulates. And so, but the wider point from that is that that is citywide information, whereas air quality is a particular problem applying to small areas, relatively small areas. And it's those relatively small areas, the ACMAs and places like Fulford Road, which have also had a historic problem of air pollution that should have been fully assessed. Citywide information is of little use to saying, because obviously most of this air pollution is from traffic, and it's the traffic along the radial routes and on the inner ring road which is causing the problem. And that has to be related to the projections of traffic increase and delay on those small areas. So, and that's why I don't think citywide information of this type is very useful to you in any way.
Mr. Linus.
Thank you, sir. I'll ask Mr. Southcombe to provide some further comments on that information in the context, first of all, of the PM 2.5 and PM 10 material. But before he does that, just pick up on a couple of points broadly. Essentially what has been raised by the Hezlington Parish Council, Mr. Merritt, has been covered already. I think in reality what Mr. Merritt is looking for is akin to this form of detail that you're going to get at a detailed application stage, which we say is not necessary for this stage. It is not that I or the Council minimises air quality concerns. It is quite the opposite. It's introduced, particularly in the plan, what it considers to be a robust policy, ENV1, which we can debate in the rest of this afternoon, alongside what we consider to be entirely adequate information to judge the cumulative effects of the plan. As for the Parish Council's position, the information which appears to be sought in the hearing statement prepared by the Parish Council, including matters such as baseline information, we say that is inevitably information which would have to be provided as part of any planning application when it comes forward, as we see ENV1 requires air quality assessment work to be carried out for individual proposals of particular sizes, and that would need to be taken into account at the time. So there's no question of air quality impacts, cumulative or otherwise, being forgotten about at planning application stage. The policy provides for that. As for CYC 91, I'll just come to Mr. Southcombe to see if he can explain, please, first of all, the relevance of the PM 2.5 and 10 figures, and then secondly, deal with Mr. Curcier's point as to the utility of the figures approached on a city-wide holistic basis, please.
I think Mr. Linus has covered some of his points already, but obviously there's two approaches. There's the general approach that says, let's look at it on a city-wide basis, and I guess this is what we've heard today, but then there's the specific approach where we look at individual planning applications and their impact on specific roads, etc., etc. And of course that will be dealt with through the planning process.
Just to pick up on a few of the comments about the 65% reduction in NOx versus only 4% in PM 2.5, most NOx, most nitrogen oxides, I should say, forgive me if I slip into the jargon, do come from traffic, hence there's a significant potential reduction, but only 4% in PM 2.5. Only a small proportion of PM 2.5, that's the small microparticulates that have the most significant impact on people's health. Only a small proportion comes from traffic. The vast bulk of PM 2.5s comes from combustion, and that will be domestic and commercial combustion. So that will be things such as wood burners in people's homes in particular. So we're talking about the local transport plan today, but obviously we are developing air quality policies all the time, and our policies will also be focusing on air pollutants from non-traffic sources. Just referring to the WHO guidelines, as Mr. Linus has already said, they are guidelines and not the law. The government is currently reviewing the objectives for air quality, and they are due to publish new objectives in October, so we look forward to those. And those will be the targets that legally we have to aspire to. That doesn't mean that our policy in York is not to reduce pollution, not just inside the AQMAs, but outside the AQMAs as much as possible. And I think new government policy will put a particular emphasis on reducing particulates. Brief mention was made by Ms Hilton concerning air quality in Hezlington. Air quality in Hezlington is very good at present. Obviously, we wouldn't want to see that deteriorate. We do have monitoring in Hezlington, and we will monitor, obviously, as developments progress. Talked about, Mr Corsier talked about historic air pollution on Fulford Road. Fulford Road currently has very low air pollution. Obviously, it was part of an air quality management area at one time. Successive council policies, as well as emission reductions of vehicles, have meant that we've been able to revoke, we've been able to remove the air quality management area in Fulford. I think the highest concentration we have in Fulford now of nitrogen dioxide is 25 compared to 40, so we are well under the health-based air quality objectives at this time. Obviously, we have an extensive air quality monitoring network on Fulford Road and further into Fishergate that would monitor any changes as a result of any of the proposed developments within the local plan.
Thank you. I'll allow if you've got some comeback on that, then let's do it briefly, because I do want to move on to ENB1, but you know it's an important matter, so I don't want to cut it short. Mr. May, let's start with you.
Very, very briefly, sir. I think it's important to bear in mind that we have two separate indicators here. What CYC 91 does is to predict changes in emissions. What the air quality monitoring reports do is indicate actual changes in concentration. And as Mr. Merritt has already indicated, there is a very complex relationship, particularly for oxides of nitrogen, between emissions and concentration. So you cannot assume that a given reduction in emissions in CYC 91 means a given reduction in concentration in a site like Gilligate. And going back to one of Mr. Southcomb's points, of course, we're here talking not about the assessment of individual developments, but the assessment of that set of developments in the plan. And we remain of the view that as yet we have not got a clear indication that concentrations, as opposed to emissions, will be at an acceptable level by 2033.
Mr. Merritt? Mr. Corsier, then I'll come to you. Sorry. Yes, go on, and then I'll come to Ms. Hezlington.
Sorry, yes, my point is very brief. I think the Council is trying to confuse the purpose of planning applications with the purpose of local plans. So the local plans are, in fact, operate as a decision in principle, which the detail is then obviously looked at the application level. And so I would remind the Council that, of course, paragraph 124 of NPPF refers to planning policies, i.e. local plans. And so the key wording in that sentence is that the planning policies should take into account the cumulative impact on air quality from individual sites. Importantly, sir, in a very given discussion we've had today, in local areas, not citywide, in local areas, i.e. the areas where there's existing poor air quality. And so this is not something that should be shunted off to a planning application. And it's really critical, sir, that that distinction is made. Thank you.
Ms. Hilton?
I was going to say something similar but in less technical language in answer to Mr. Linus. I maybe didn't explain myself very clearly, but what my feeling was that you're going to have a sequence of planning applications over a long period, a number of years probably. And if each time you get a planning application, you then assess the air quality, you're assessing against a different baseline from if you started by assessing the air quality right now as to what the baseline is today. I'm not talking about in Hezlington village, but in the areas which are currently countryside and they're not built developments. So my point was really about starting with what we have now, the kind of air quality that we enjoy now, and not each time saying, well, it was okay for that development, and this development is a little bit worse, and now this development is a little bit worse, but we still haven't breached the regulations, so we're okay. You would never know then how far you drifted from what the original air quality had been. Thank you.
Mr. Linus?
Yes, sir, I can be very brief. I think in response to Mr. Cursier, our point is that that's reading it far too prescriptively, paragraph 124 of the framework, to suggest that that is indicating that you must carry out cumulative impacts on specific local areas within a local administrative area. We just don't consider that the policy is intended to be as prescriptive as that. It's entirely consistent to look at local areas in the way that the Council has done. That's the first point. Secondly, in any event, the sustainability appraisal does look at strategic sites individually and reaches a view on cumulative impacts in that context. Thirdly, NPPG on air quality, we say again, doesn't have any prescriptive approach to how air quality is considered as part of the local plan process. It is entirely opposite to produce a sustainability appraisal which looks at air quality objectives and then drawing on monitoring data, consider what the prospect is for trends on a holistic basis across the city. So we reject Mr. Cursier's approach. As for Ms. Hilton, again, we do understand the difference between local plan making and development management, but the concerns that she is raising are matters that are entirely appropriately dealt with at the planning application stage on the basis that the local plan process has been followed adequately.
Okay, look, I do think we need to press on and look at ENV1. Was there anything you wanted to say at the outset about that policy, Mr. Linus? I think it's been modified.
It has been modified, sir. You'll see the modifications at the appendix to the hearing statement. The general rationale behind suggesting those changes was to be absolutely clear about what was going to be expected in terms of different categories of development, and having a clearer relationship between the text within the policy and the supporting text. The fundamental point is it's designed to be a robust policy which ensures that air quality is properly considered in relation to proper categories of development at planning application stage. But beyond that, I don't think we need to say anything more, subject to any comments that others have on it.
Is there anything anyone wants to say about ENV1 as modified? Bearing in mind that, you know, if this modification is taken forward in that form, there will be another opportunity. This isn't the only chance you get to address it. Mr. May, did you have something you wanted to say? Anybody else?
I'll just briefly say, I'm sorry, dealing with all the other stuff, I've just done a chance to read it, but I'll refer you to our original comments, where we made the point that the problem with the existing policy in the main is that quite often for peripheral development, although they have a significant impact, it's not normally enough to take them up over the guideline locally, and they're so remote from the places where there is a problem that the contribution at the particular AQMA type locations is not of significance enough for action to be taken. So, you know, the existing policy actually does nothing other than ensure that if there is a local problem, the particular premise gets appropriate window and other ventilation treatment to stop the problem in the particular premises. It does nothing to contribute to solving the overall problems, which is why the discussion that we had on 7.3 is so important, that you actually, you've only got the one place where you can effectively deal with the cumulative effect, and that is at the local plan policy stage.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt. Mr. Linus?
Very, very briefly, the way the policy is drafted is intended to apply to all development proposals. So although there is a requirement to submit a detailed air quality assessment for particular applications that are identified there, the first paragraph is still an overarching requirement, which means that development will only be permitted if the impact on air quality is acceptable. So insofar as there's a concern about development proposals maybe, for example, outside AQMAs not being caught by any sort of policy principles, that's not the purpose of ENV 1. All development will have to show that any impact on air quality is acceptable.
Thank you, Mr. Linus. Has anyone got anyone to add on this? Okay, it's been a long day, but thank you for it. I mean, these matters do require proper consideration, so I'm grateful both sides. Tomorrow, 9:30 start. It's Greenbelt boundaries again, isn't it? So I'll see some of you then. I shall look forward to it. Have a pleasant evening, everyone. Thanks very much.